Hi there, and welcome to the fourth of our interviews around goals for change, which is what we're trying to do for the month of July. And today I'm going to speak with Vicky, and I'm very excited to have Vicky here. We have spoken to Vicky before on the Just One Thing interview, so you're welcome to go and have a look at that. And Vicky's specialism is around tourism, and because this is something I don't do, it's really nice to have such an expert with us. And we're going to have a look at Vicky's suggestion. We're going to actually look through all of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not just cherry picking today, so we can't just ignore the ones that we don't want to try and work on. So I think that's going to be really interesting. So welcome, Vicky. Tell us what you're up to, because we know a little bit about EarthChangers from our meeting before, but I know that new things have been happening. So give us a quick update.
Thank you. So yes, EarthChangers is a startup which focuses on positive impact tourism. So it's not just about minimizing the negatives, but it's about maximizing the positives that can be created through tourism. And that's very much basically the benefits that align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So how tourism can help, for example, health and education and employment, all these things. Because basically at the root of everything is we live in a very unequal and unjust world. And tourism is one of the few vehicles that you can actually use to try and equalize some of that. Obviously, it's a passion for many people, including myself, which is travel. So if you can have an amazing time whilst actually creating that positive impact, then it's win-win. That's what it's all about, basically. So I write a lot. So before we go into all of these, it's probably worth saying I've got a very extensive page on each of these on my website if people want more details, because there's such huge chunky subjects that are very interrelated, and quite a lot of content for me to keep updated. And then what else I've been up to is writing a lot of content for the site so people can understand sustainable tourism better. But also one of the things that's happened to me this year, amongst other people within the Ethical Hour community, I was asked by DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, to be an ambassador for them, partly because of my work in tourism and how much I talk about how it can be a positive impact. So I've been involved in all sorts of things through them, such as Bees Knees Week in London. I was along to Carnaby Street and talking to people about pollinators. I presented an internal award for them recently and their green action teams that they've got within the department. What else have I been doing? I've been to the 70th birthday for the national parks, which was brilliant. I grew up in Yorkshire, so I love the fact that someone from the Dales won, so that was brilliant. So that was good. So yeah, keeping me busy, many of these things. And really I'm sort of banging the drum about sustainable tourism wherever I go and however I can.
So did the Sustainable Development Goals, are they something you knew about way back when and were always part of your kind of planning and thinking?
Yeah.
Or are they something that's come more recently?
No, I always was. So I studied a master's in responsible tourism management from 2009 to 2012. And they were within those because the Sustainable Development Goals were created by the UN to follow on from what was the Millennial Development Goals. And so I was familiar with them, and through working on developing my own site, which was kind of a separate thing at the time, I suddenly realized actually this is what I should do and this is how to focus it to some extent. And not all the issues that I might deal with are represented by the goals, actually. For example, culture doesn't have a specific goal, but that's because it's a very difficult thing to measure, and actually it comes into many of the others. So some of the things I talk about sort of transcend the goals, but a lot of the work is around those goals, because ultimately what it does is it takes UN policy from a global level down to a grassroots level, in a few clicks. And that's kind of part of the aim of my site, was to be able to let people understand how tourism works with the SDGs, but also to translate it to that very practical angle and about what organisations in destinations are doing in order to address those issues.
Because part of what we wanted to achieve this month was a conversation, to have people talking about them and them being something real and not something out there, which is how I felt about them. And then also really get into the nitty gritty, which is, and how do I do that? How do I work on them? Because they are very you know, they're inspirational and they're aspirational, and you know, they do feel very big. And so part of what we wanted to do was try and sort of give people ideas for the reality of what you can do in everyday life, in your life, and in your choices that supports them. So you had this idea that we'd go through all of them. I feel that this is that's aspirational as well.
I think so too, depending how much time you have.
We haven't covered them all yet because we've been doing them sort of day by day, or I've been doing them day by day. But I think we're nearly there. I think we'll finish. I think we get to 16 on Friday, so we're nearly there. So, but the first one is no poverty.
Yeah.
Is that one that fits within your tourism?
Yes, absolutely. So if we look at the big issue in poverty, it's basically, it's defined as having beneath $1.90 per person per day. And the majority of people that are in that pocket are in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. And that's where we suddenly go, okay, developing countries, they account for 45% of world tourism and 35% of that international tourism money. So actually, tourism is one thing that can really help developing countries, and in particular those people in extreme poverty. And it does that by employment issues, it brings in gender, we'll talk about all these other things. But basically you get money into those destinations, and suddenly those people then have jobs on which they can spend on health, on education, on water, such and such. But, you know, it doesn't happen with all tourism, because a lot of tourism historically has been focused on a capitalist company benefiting. And so what you have to do is choose tourism very intentionally, which is responsible tourism, which has what they call a pro-poor approach, which is a bit of a unfashionable term now, it's a bit passé, but basically that intentional approach that the money is going into the poverty in the areas. So for example, I work with an organization in India that organizes village to village trekking, but the whole purpose of it is to bring money into rural communities. It's to keep the people within those rural communities so that they have jobs, it prevents a rural brain drain, and it enables the cultural preservation. So without tourism, there wouldn't be anyone there, and it would all go to rack and ruin, basically. So that's how tourism can do that, yeah.
It's quite key, actually, when you think about that. Direct, I mean, that's a huge percentage. 45% is extraordinary.
Yeah.
You know, the impact could be massive, couldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of my arguments for having sustainable tourism, and it hasn't worked that way in the past because our companies haven't been that sustainable, and they've exploited to be able to profit themselves. But in actual fact, what we really should be doing is supporting the rest of the world with this. And because ultimately we consume destinations, culture, nature, you know, all those things that we love when we go on trips. We ought to be paying for them for that, and it's the host communities that own that.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah. So how does that, I guess that links, I've always seen the first two as very linked, really.
Very linked, yeah.
If you live in poverty, then your food options are obviously limited. So the zero hunger, I'm assuming that's a similar argument around tourism.
Exactly. So you've got very similar numbers in the world who are A, in poverty, but B, undernourished or in malnutrition. And again, it's Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. In actual fact, there's more in Asia, malnutrition, than there is in Africa. It's the other way around. And then we've got issues that come into it later with climate change, because that really actually exacerbates hunger issues because of floods and droughts and agriculture. And how we fit with tourism is that, you know, food is such an important part of travel. And, you know, we often like to go abroad because we want to try different foods and meals. And more people are trying, you know, cook like a local type experiences. They want to see how it's produced and made. We might watch at a chef's table, take those sort of lessons, if you like. And so the more we can support local food production, the more by buying locally and eating locally, the more money can go into those destinations. And again, like you say, it links with the poverty.
And I guess if people are earning a living wage, then again, that allows them to purchase food, you know, better quality food, or
exactly.
higher quantity food.
So exactly. So food is very much, you know, obviously agriculture, livelihoods are linked with food, and things like beekeeping
many tourism organisations can start beekeeping projects which A, provide jobs and income, but B, also create honey, and that honey can then either be used or sold. So one of the organisations I work with in Madagascar, they work on a sustainable lobster fishing project, and so they've created what's called a no-take zone, because that means that near the shore you can't take the nearest lobster, and you can't take the baby lobster. You can only take them when they've grown, because they've had a chance to reproduce. If you're constantly taking the smaller lobsters or the ones near the shore, you're going to basically ruin your lobster population. And that lobster market and fishery is so important to those men, but also therefore their families. It's sort of, a virtuous circle once you get into the more sustainable, practical ways of managing it.
It's really interesting because, one of the number 14, I'm jumping ahead, is life below water, which would come back to the lobster management thing. And they are all, once you start looking at them, you do have to look at them all together, don't you? Because they are so intertwined.
They're so interrelated, yeah, absolutely. Which was one reason I wanted to write about them all, because actually they interlink massively, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and then, the third one is ensure healthy lives and well-being, right? And so that inevitably leads on from poverty and food malnutrition as well. Yeah. So if you haven't got money and you can't buy food, well, you're not going to be very healthy. So we start reversing that cycle, getting people have money, being able to buy better food, like you said, more healthy lives. And at the moment, there's a very similar number of people in the world who spend at least 10% of household budget on health expenses for themselves or a family member. And so it's similar number to those that are in poverty, similar number to those that are malnutrition. So it's also interlinked. It's not necessarily 100% the same people, but it's not surprising if it were to be the same people. And, a lot of places around the world don't have access to the healthcare we do, especially, free. Most often they're private, and therefore they're forced to choose between paying for private healthcare or other expenses on a daily basis, like food and clothing. And it's like, well, how do you make that choice? And so you end up with a not very well population, issues around particularly reproductive, maternal and child health, sexual health, diseases, environmental diseases, mental health as well. And now even like plastic pollution, how that links in with some of the other things is plastic pollution is actually creating and spreading diseases as well. So, health systems are very, very under-resourced all around the world. We think we've got a problem with the national health in the UK. It's enormous anywhere else you go, basically. They won't have a national health system. And so that universal health coverage is key to the World Health Organization's goals. And it's how we can do that. And again, it's bringing money in, getting people to eat better, getting out and about as well in nature, and supporting people. If they're in poverty, it's not surprising they might have mental health issues dealing with it, So a lot of the places I work with in developing countries, they from the tourism money they create, they invest in local community health projects. And that might be, for example, providing the only doctor. In Kenya, they provide the only ambulance in supporting 16,000 Maasai community. It's providing solar power for health clinics. It might be creating a Red Cross branch. That's what they do with the place I work with in Nepal, so that they have a training centre for disaster preparedness, which they obviously had to do since the last earthquake there. And so fighting sort of malnutrition and things actually often comes down to tourism operations, because they're the ones who are generating some money, and so they can contribute to communities in that way. And something that we forget about for us and how that fits in is our travel is very important to our health and our mental health, and having a detox and having a switch off. And so you might go on a fabulous horse riding trip like we deal with in Croatia, a ranch that we work with there, or a trail running trip we've got with Kelly Holmes in Malawi. But actually us having healthy holidays can support the health of the communities that we go to. Yeah.
That's a really amazing change, isn't it? Because a lot of us are choosing to not have those trips because of the impact, the potential negative impact of the flight and various of the reasons why we might choose not to do that. But actually, if we make really careful choices about how we do it, it could have a really positive impact.
Absolutely.
And that local community could be massively improved.
That's the whole point of sustainable tourism, and you'll see this coming into every point we talk about. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about everything as a whole, because it's very easy for people to go, oh, we should fly, not fly, full stop. But actually what you end up doing is cutting off the rest of the world and the benefits that they can get from our tourism, and actually saying on a holistic basis, we're actually pretty well placed in the world. We're all right compared to many, many, many countries. And it's taking a wider perspective than just the pure aviation emissions, to say actually travel's really important as a global sector in what it can achieve to people. Yeah.
It brings us on to number 4, which is quality education. And I think the obvious place to look at is, people, young women, particularly girls, who perhaps don't get any education at all. But actually, I think quality education isn't just about, the very basics of education. It's about things like learning,
yes,
the impact that you have. So, as an adult, I feel I need a quality education in terms of what I can do to have a positive impact, what I should be looking for, what all the different symbols. This is another pet peeve of mine, all these different symbols on packaging, what they actually mean. So I think the education one's very broad, in fact, because there are obviously issues in making sure that everyone has access to basic learning. But I think there's also a lot of misinformation around that could be challenged.
Absolutely. And if we go back to real primary age, like you say, an awful lot of kids around the world never get the option to go to primary school. And if they're never learning in the first place, or they drop out, before they're probably 10 or something like that, how are they ever going to understand these issues of health and things that they need to learn as well, if they've not been educated around them? Something like sexual reproduction and the issues that we get around that. So, I'm a big fan of lifelong learning. I do lots of courses myself. Part of me doing my startup and writing everything about I'm learning too while I'm doing that. And like you say, how it comes to tourism is tourism provides, it works in 2 ways. One, it provides incomes which can build schools and support child education places and pay for teachers and pay for equipment in the schools. But what it also does is create jobs, and the jobs create learning opportunities. So it's training, it's skills development in adults. So whether that's through language, because inevitably, probably they learn English because many tourists speak English, and the potential that they then have for self-development is actually then really important for their dignity and their self-esteem. So education through tourism, is a sort of long-term empowerment issue for communities. Mm. And so, we work with, you mentioned girls, we work with a lodge in Morocco, and they were set up first and foremost to support local community, in particular around education. And in Morocco, girls didn't go to school because of the religion there means they need to be segregated. And the schools weren't in the local Atlas Mountain villages. The schools were further afield in the cities. So the boys would be allowed to go off to the cities, but the girls wouldn't, because they wouldn't be allowed to mix with boys. And so this lodge that we work with, through the income from tourism, then creates boarding houses and sponsorship places that enable the girls to continue in education. So they go off to the city, but they live with, more mature ladies who make sure they keep an eye on them and do what they're meant to do, etc. So they are now, before they weren't going to school after 12 years old. Now they're going to university for the first time. And this lodge has supported tens of girls now to get to university. I think the first one's recently got a PhD or something, which is the skills that they can then bring back to their villages and how they can affect their local communities in sustainable development, for example, is phenomenal.
And it is that long-term plan, isn't it? All of those people getting that education and that life learning that can then have a really positive contribution in the world. It's this really It's a bigger vision, isn't it?
Particularly
of what we
women,
want the world to be
Claire,
like.
particularly women, actually. And it's been shown. I mean, we're coming on to gender now, actually, and this is
number 5. We're here.
Segue, right? It's been shown that if you educate women and they then go into the workforce and they're earning their money, they actually spend more than would come from a man's budget on the family's health, the family's education, and they support more people within the community. So in actual fact, it's women who will lift this planet out of, poverty, probably, because actually the men have been working historically. What we need to change is actually getting more women around the world into work. Developing countries, it's still quite a difficult cultural issue in some places. But ultimately, we're pretty divided in the world, 50-50 of how many men, how many women there are. And if most of those women, or many of those women, aren't fulfilling their potential, basically, and they're not working, and half of humanity is denied its right to have full human rights, really, and opportunities, it's not surprising we're not going to, improve. But if we allow that, and if we empower that, that can then really make such a huge difference. There's a quote I like somewhere. I'll have to come back to it. I've forgotten it.
It will come to you.
Yeah.
There's more on equality, don't worry.
That's true.
It brings us on then to clean water and sanitation. Now, I imagine within tourism, this is quite a key topic, because lots of people who might choose to go to a very, very mainstream sort of place, or stay in a hotel, or eat, not eat foreign food, is they sort of want to be in Britain but with nicer weather. A lot of their fears or concerns are probably around clean water and sanitation and keeping healthy and all this. So how do we encourage people to go off the beaten track a little and to be more comfortable in local surroundings with local people if they have these fears? Are they unfounded fears, or is there any sort of truth to it? Often
they're fairly unfounded. There's issues around water in globally. There's cleanliness of water, and then there's availability of water, and actually availability of water is becoming a bigger and bigger issue every year. So that's affecting destinations. For example, Cape Town last year had major drought for a long time, so that affects tourism massively. And the other thing in tourism is that tourists use more water away than they do at home. And actually it's the same with energy and things like that, because they get a bit more kind of, they're on holiday, they'll just use whatever they want to use. So what we have to do is make sure that the right to water and the right to clean water isn't compromised by tourism, but that tourism actually can be the supporter to make it better. And again, it comes down to getting money in, because tourism can actually create the infrastructure in destinations to create that clean water. So, for example, a lodge in Nicaragua I work with, they, local people were drinking out of Lake Nicaragua, and they potentially were getting ill and spreading, disease or whatever from that. And so the lodge created water filtration plant, which not only supports all the tourists, but actually supports a 600 strong village as well. So often it's tourism that drives the developments and the more sustainable developments. And what we have to do is get people to be considerate of the amount of water they use when they're away. And just because they're away doesn't mean to say they can just not think about it. In actual fact, they think about it more. For their own personal water consumption, many, many lodges now provide reusable water bottles, water filter or filtered water. And then obviously people can invest in their own water filter. I work with an organisation. We've got a 15% discount code if anyone wants one on super duper water filtration bottles called Water to Go. And what often many destinations do is actually create the rainwater harvesting infrastructure that actually can support local communities with catching fresh water, basically, for use. So in the design of hotels, for example, or we work with one place that's an island where they although they're a very small island, you can't drink the water from the sea. You have to go through desalination. So they capture the rainwater in very specially designed bungalows, and it all goes underneath the bungalow into a sort of catchment place that they're then able to use within the bungalow for both the showers but also drinking water. So it's all very, very smart kind of innovations on how hotels are actually designed to be able to be more sustainable on the resources they use.
Because it does seem ridiculous, doesn't it? You know, in the modern world, when, you know, there are 4,000 varieties of cereal in the supermarket, you know, how can it be that I can get water, you know, out of a tap on demand as much as I like, hose my garden, you know, clean my car, whatever.
Yeah.
And then there's a capital city of a major nation that is running out of water.
Yeah.
It just seems kind of, I find it so hard sometimes to match these things together.
And yes, absolutely. And that's the life we are lucky to lead actually in the UK, because we don't have those extreme heats and extreme droughts. Often we do, you know, we're starting to get that more and more. And as climate change impacts rise, we will get it more and more. So, you know, water will be the oil of the future. It will be the most scarce but most required, needed commodity. It's going to be so valuable. And so, you know, where the lodge we work with in Nepal, they needed a water source where they're miles up a mountain, you know, and so there was a local spring. And so what they did was, you know, just tap the local spring. But part of the deal of sustainable tourism developments is that you involve that community. So in tapping the local spring, they said, okay, obviously the local community must be able to use it and have free access to that as well. So the local community are happy with that. But not only that, the local community used to walk miles, and it was always the girls that did it because the girls weren't at school, right? So the girls would walk miles to get buckets of water and bring them back from wherever they were going before. And so what it's meant is not only do the community now have access to fresh water, the girls now have time and they're going to school, and all round everyone's got better health. So it all interlinks with poverty and health issues, etc., etc. So it's about creating how tourism can help create infrastructure for local people so that they can benefit in order to A, catch fresh water, and then B, access that.
Yeah.
And the next one, number 7, is linked. It's about energy, you know, affordable and clean energy, and the two aren't always the same thing. So is that similar projects, solar projects, wave, wind? Is that
very, very similar? You know, around the world, lots of people lack access to energy, full stop. Again, it's linked with the poverty and everything. And often they're using quite polluting fuels and stoves and things like that, and kerosene and charcoal. And actually that creates health issues for them. And so, and millions of deaths a year. So the more we can shift to alternative energies, the better it is. And many holiday destinations are absolutely, you know, ripe for alternative energies. So whether it's islands with water and wind power, or whether it's sunny destinations with solar, and it's about creating that infrastructure and financing that infrastructure that you then enable local communities to have access to.
Do people, I kind of have this vision of people who go on sustainable development. I may be very unkind, but do people still expect, you know, to be able to plug in and charge up and keep their Instagram running? And, you know, are people's expectations sometimes completely out of kilter with the reality?
Yeah. But, I mean, to be honest, probably the number one demand of tourists worldwide anywhere in doing anything, well, not number one, you know, apart from food and shelter, probably number 3 is Wi-Fi these days. And some lodges, for example, some places in the past have not put it throughout the properties, or they've not allowed it, because actually it's important to sort of switch off and detox as well from our modern life as much as anything else. But such is the demand, what they tend to do now is maybe have a lounge area where people can go and access it if they want. But yes, definitely those demands are still there. So it is quite tricky. But again, what happens is because the consumer demand is there, tourism establishments then want to supply that, you know, that power for their customers, because they want to keep the customers happy. But what they are able to do is create the infrastructure that then you know, creates a business case for the local community having it, basically. And what it also does is that means that tourism organizations really focus on the measuring and monitoring of it, because it's valuable, right? It's quite precious when they've created something like this. So if they're then focused on the measuring and monitoring of it, they're actually much more attuned into how sustainable it is and how to improve it, because they want to keep their costs down as much as anyone else. So in actual fact, like anything sustainable is better for the long term. It might require a bit of upfront investment and a bit of an outlay, but ultimately it's going to be much better for them in the long term. So they are tending to create these innovative, sustainable energy solutions in places that actually, I think sometimes the more less developed a country, the more remote you are, the more creative they actually are, and the more willing they are to actually invest in that sort of thing.
Well, it's a win-win, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of harnessing the power of nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, just set the wind chime off. To, you know, to support the local economy, and if that can be funded, you know, through something like tourism that can have this positive impact. And
if we can reduce that consumption by saying, okay, actually, you know what, no TVs, DVDs, telephones, mini bars mini fridges in the rooms, and there's it's low voltage, no aircon, for example. Aircon's an absolute killer on energy. How they cook, you know, what fuels they use, how they light. The tourism establishments are interested in keeping their costs low, but they're obviously sustainable tourism also wants to have the least negative impact. And actually, you can actually create a really, therefore, lovely environment, which is that switch off from home. It's just that we have to get a bit more used to be willing to experience. Actually, it's different. You're not necessarily going to get it exactly as it is at home, basically.
It's being unavailable, isn't it? I think there's this terror, you know, of something happening in the world and us not knowing within 3 seconds.
Yeah, whereas I quite like that sometimes.
Yeah, it's a willingness to just switch off. It's rather exciting. That sort of covers 8 and 9, because we're looking at decent work, and economic growth, which we've said is going to come if we can put money into these more rural communities or more less developed communities. And then 9 is infrastructure and innovation, which is happening, it sounds. That people are kind of given the opportunity, it flourishes.
Yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, it's about being given the opportunity. So what historically has happened is tourism has been something which has been decided from outside of a community or outside of a country even. You know, it's us in the UK saying we're going to go there and we're going to do that, and it's switching it round to say local people and local communities are the ones who are the decision makers. They decide what they want, how much they allow, what they're interested in developing, and then it's up to them. And we can come and advise and try and support it, but it's about switching the power of responsibility back so the decisions are all in their hands.
Which is number 10, which is reduced inequality. It's saying actually, because I guess some areas, I assume there are some communities who actually don't want tourists because they may have seen or heard of areas being, you know, wrecked by a style of tourism that is not careful and kind.
Yes.
So I can imagine some communities going, actually, we don't want all these foreign individuals coming here, you know,
well, hopefully,
our beautiful area.
And hopefully people are, and this comes back to education, hopefully people are showing them this is what can happen and that they're aware of that. The difficulty is those, you know, very obviously remote communities often are really keen to have money as well. So they're keen for modern developments, but sometimes they're not even, you know, sometimes we have more appreciation for their heritage than they necessarily do themselves, which is a bit crazy. But it's about, educating them round about actually that's your culture and that's actually what attracts people. But that's what we want to keep. And what's happened with mass tourism is it's gone into places and absolutely killed the culture as well as the environment. And therefore, all the original reasons we wanted to go to those places has been annihilated. And then we go, we don't want to go there anymore. And then you leave this some sort of monstrosity. I mean, what's fascinating is somewhere like Benidorm in Spain. Benidorm is now designated a UNESCO heritage site. because it's so the pinnacle of mass tourism development that they hold it up as a kind of unique destination for that, to kind of show to people this is what can happen, right? And try and actually prevent that happening. Because what happens, I mean, we're getting it now with over-tourism, and we'll come on to this when we talk about cities. Not that over-tourism only happens in cities, it happens all over. But you create these sort of centres of focus of huge amounts of tourism, and then outside there's nothing. And actually all it does is push local people out. And once you push local people out, you lose the soul of a place, you lose its culture, you lose its feel, you lose its atmosphere. And we don't want to go on holiday for that. We want to go for the difference, actually.
I mean, it happens even in the UK, doesn't it? I'm thinking of this reduced inequalities in relation to, you know, there's lots of people who live in, I mean, even the where I grew up, you know, I couldn't afford to live there, despite having been born there, because it's a trendy place, it's a fashionable place. Lots of people have weekend cottages there. Lots of the sort of little properties that perhaps a first-time buyer or a retiring couple might have gone for are now weekend cottages for London folk to come down to for the weekend.
Absolutely.
That reduced inequalities, it can take lots of different forms, can't it? Because I think very picturesque places, very beautiful places, are often very difficult places for the local community to maintain living in, let alone working in, just because, you know, it's inherently a beautiful place, and so people with more money can afford to buy there.
Yeah, exactly. So somewhere like Cornwall, you know, they have that problem where, you know, you have got loads of second home owners that are coming down from London, and it prices them out of the market. And the less local people that are living in their place, the less support services they'll have for each other. And so it becomes more and more difficult. And so, so tourism is a way that you can redistribute that, basically. And really that's the basis of actually EarthChangers, is actually my thinking. I'm probably at the root of my personal values is about equality. And it's about making the world a little bit more equal. That's what I want to do.
It's wonderful. So number 11 then, you touched on it, sustainable cities and communities. And I've been working on this. This has been my one, around community living, because I love my local community, and we very purposely, it shocks people because it's not got the best reputation, our town, but we purposely chose to live here. We could have lived anywhere. We had no roots particularly. We had lots and lots of options and choices, and we picked here, and people think that's hilarious when they meet us. But I do think that sense of community is really powerful. But you mentioned cities in particular, sustainable cities.
The reason I mention cities is that cities are just 3% of the Earth's land, but they are probably 70% of energy consumption and carbon emissions. More than half the world's population, expected to be like 60%, or by 2050 it's going to be like 2/3 of all humanity live in those cities. So there's these huge conurbations and concentrations of human activity, if you like, which brings with it economies of scale, goods, services, transportation, all those sorts of things. But what it also brings is, within that concentration, then huge poverty as well, often, and, you know, disease and malnutrition, etc., etc. So what's happening from a tourism point of view is certain cities, like you say, the more attractive ones, for example, are suffering because the more people want to go to them, the more mass tourism has provided the opportunities for them to go to, and the more people they're kind of feeding into these cities, and then the more local residents are leaving. So basically, on a global basis, if you've got crews coming in, a cruise port, if you've got cheap flights, and if you've got Airbnb, basically as a kind of attractive place, you're probably going to suffer from what we call over-tourism. And that seems to be the sort of three major contenders at the moment. So we're talking, you know, in Europe, it's in particular European cities, because they're very culturally led. Barcelona, Reykjavik, Venice, Rome, and all these places, they're actually starting, what they've done is they've prioritized mass tourism coming in for the money, because of what the money can do that we've talked about. But what it's led to is too many people in comparison to residents, and too many people in comparison to the space they've got. And then the residents move out. So they've prioritized the mass tourism income over their own residents. And if you've heard of the name of responsible tourism as opposed to sustainable tourism, the definition of responsible tourism is creating better places for people to live in and visit. And the people live in comes first. That should be the priority. So by creating more responsible tourism, by focusing on the local people, you then create a more sustainable tourism industry, if you like. It's sort of the route to get there. And so residents' quality of life should come before tourists. And therefore, you create a nice place for the tourists to come and visit and enjoy. A city is nice to visit because it prioritizes local needs, and therefore it creates a nice place to come and visit.
Does that inherently push up prices?
Yes.
If you're reducing the number of people and you are inherently... Do you think, I was discussing this around fashion with Joe Salter, that we've become, our perception of price has been completely skewed.
Yes.
And our understanding of what things should cost is now kind of ridiculous.
Yes, completely.
Has tourism done the same? You know, is our perception of what a flight should be, or a reasonable amount of money for that now completely...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's caused by mass industry needing mass volumes to make it cost efficient. And so they just cut costs or cut prices, even with lost leaders half the time. You know, we see airlines suddenly going bust and then making $1 million, then going bust and making $1 million. They're on this sort of trajectory that's constantly on a big roller coaster up and down. And that's that very small price sensitivity, basically. And, you know, taking aviation as an example, aviation fuel isn't taxed in the way that we, for example, pay the huge taxes on our petrol, which it should be. And if we were to face the prices of aviation with a tax which covers the true cost, which is the carbon impact as well, for example, that would really affect demand. That's likely to come in the UK. That's likely to come in the EU in the coming years, even months potentially, by some destinations. So we're going to have a massive shift around of our perception of what price is and what is value, because it's been basically mass production has created deep value, a lack of value.
Absolutely, it's fascinating stuff.
And in tourism, we're getting to the point now where we're doing what's called demarketing, if you've ever heard of that. So places like Amsterdam, Venice, they're coming in with various initiatives to try and not encourage any more people, or actively discourage. And that might be they're trying to shift people from peak seasons into shoulder seasons. It might be they're trying to shift people to a slightly different destination outside a centre. For example, Amsterdam has renamed a place, can't remember what its previous name was, but they've renamed it Amsterdam Beach because it sounds more attractive, so people go and stay over there, right? Venice has brought in what's always been there before, certain rules about behaviour in Venice. It's it's like not jumping in the canals and things like that. But what it's doing is now enforcing it quite strongly. So these places don't become just almost lawless, disrespectful. A lot of it's about respect in the place that you are staying. And probably part of respect is paying it its fair contribution, right?
Absolutely. It comes on to number 12 perfectly, which is that responsible consumption. Actually, and I battle with myself because sometimes I think, well, that makes it very elitist then, you can only go to this place if you have lots of money. But actually, maybe the idea of saving for something and prioritizing what's really valuable to you and it being something really special is the bit that we've lost. With the sense of entitlement we have is almost taking over from a sense of sort of joy and excitement and savouring.
Exactly.
So I do battle with that and wanting it to be fair and wanting people to have opportunities, but equally trying to balance that actually saving up for something would make that amazing. And
I think the difference is like you say, people have come to expect travel. They think it's a right when it's not, it's a privilege. when we grew up, we didn't expect to go off to a European destination every 2 months for a weekend. It didn't do us any harm by not doing that. We had aspirations to go to Venice, wherever. So, a lot of the, particularly around the issues of flying, I'm not against cutting flying, even though I'm running a tourism business, because actually I'm about saving up and appreciating what you can achieve, less frequently, more value in it, better impact in it, and actually it becomes more valuable. Like it's a better quality experience basically as well.
Because interestingly, although we travel more and we sort of see these, I'm using the royal we here, people are more globally interactive, they travel more, they see different cultures. I don't particularly see that as having had a massive impact in terms of how kind we are to each other, or less war, or less whatever. So it's interesting that my immediate reaction to people not traveling as much would be, but we wouldn't be able to appreciate each other's cultures as well, and that would lead to sort of isolationist policies. I'm a historian, as you can imagine. But actually, that won't necessarily be the case, because people might have better quality travel,
exactly,
and better quality interactions while they travel,
exactly,
and that might actually lead to a better.
And it's actually interaction that actually makes our trips. We remember the people we meet. We remember the experience we have with them, the food and things like that. We don't remember what bed we slept in necessarily, or the swimming pool. So you search on one lot of criteria, right, when you're looking for a place, but actually what you take away is something quite different. So it's very people-led tourism, and the quality of interaction with those people, and when you feel you're supporting them, they're happy and they respond to you because they're happy in their jobs, it's such a different thing. And what has happened in mass tourism, it's taken all emotion out of it. It's become database driven, it's become uncaring, it's become tick boxes, and actually it is nothing like a more satisfying experience.
Interesting stuff. It comes on to 13, which is climate action.
This is a biggie.
Yeah, we
could
probably talk about this one just on its own, couldn't we? Is there a nutshell? Is there a nugget about climate action?
The nugget is, in my opinion, aviation is really important. Obviously, that's the one thing. If I say I work in sustainable tourism, they said, well, how can you justify that when people have to fly? Comes back to education again. It's about knowing the facts of what tourism or aviation emissions represent. At the moment, tourism accounts for 8% of global emissions, and that's tourism in total. So that's transport, food, beverages, infrastructure, all those things. So of that, about 40% is aviation. So of total global emissions, aviation is roughly about 2.5%. So it's not 50%. Some people suddenly think it's the worst thing in the world. However, it is growing, and it's growing faster than probably other industries because of that consumer demand and because of those no-frill flights. So also what happens is when you burn aviation fuel at altitude, it has a magnifying effect which can potentially up to double it. So it could be that we're saying that aviation is roughly 5% of impact at the moment on emissions. And if that grows, we're looking at doubling that or even more. And it's potentially by 2030, we could look at aviation actually representing something like 25% of emissions. So what we need to do is curb that aviation and obviously try and replace it as soon as possible with a non-polluting fuel, non-emissions generating fuel, whatever. They're working on that. They're expecting that to take about a decade. In the meantime, what we don't want to do is increase. Now, the aviation industry has got itself together with a voluntary agreement to cap emissions at next year's levels, and beyond that, they're working a kind of offset scheme, if you like. But it's only voluntary, and it's only capping. It's not based on reduction. So it's just worth keeping in mind the numbers. And what we can do as individuals is just very carefully consider where we don't have to fly, where can we get the train, or because aviation is 40% of tourism, 60% would also be the case if we have a staycation. So it's worth remembering, well, what about the carbon in the accommodations we choose? What about whether we drive and have a hire car? All the excursions we do, there's carbon impacts of all that. So it's about looking at it sort of holistically and then saying, what can we reduce? So, you know, walk and cycle in destinations. Take the train where you can. And if you do, where you do fly, is make sure that it's a positive impact. I mean, I personally don't think people need to fly to Geneva and back in a day for a business meeting. You know, we've got Skype, we've got endless communications like Zoom we're using now. It's totally unnecessary. So cut the unnecessary. I don't think people need to go to a European destination every other month, for example, but instead go to one, you know, twice a year, or less. Cut your travel by half, but you can still have an amazing time and stay longer in that destination. I've got loads of other tips on a blog on my website, actually, top 10 tips for reducing carbon impact.
I will. Can I link to that? That'll be great.
Yeah, do. It's all about how you, you know, it's even the airlines you choose, more economic ones. It's having economy seats and not first class, because economy takes up less space, therefore less carbon per person. All these things. Yeah, there's lots of bits you can consider.
Brilliant stuff. I love it. So life below water, do any of your trips take people to the ocean?
We do. We have a ocean conservation and exploration and expeditions trips. So they actually go off to the gyres and they see the plastic in the oceans, which is, you know, seeing is believing stuff. I think once you've seen something like that, that would really, really affect your behaviour. And they do lots of other trips where they're looking at, you know, marine conservation, whether it's wildlife, corals, what have you. But also lots of places we work with are coastal, and they might have mangroves locally, which are very important as well. And whether you're, you know, whether in tourism and the sea are interrelated. We swim in it, we dive in it, we sail over it, we eat from it, you know, and coastal communities and tourism are very, very interlinked in how they support each other. So that life underwater is incredibly important to tourism.
How do you choose your destinations and the options available? Are you going sort of from demand out, or are you finding the great projects and offering them?
Finding the projects, yeah. I go more back from, and also from a need perspective to some extent. So it's a bit of a balance to say, okay, where's need, where's got great projects? But equally, for example, let's say something came along in Sudan, that probably might be my priority. You still want destinations where there's going to be that consumer demand and people want to go to that in order to have those impacts. I mean, I haven't got half as many places on site as I've potentially got. I've got a very, very, very long list to add. And I go through a process. I mean, I've been in sustainable tourism for 13 years now, and in tourism as a whole for 25 years. So because I've worked in destinations myself, I've worked in conservation, I've worked abroad, you know, I've got academics in it, etc. I've got a very good understanding of how it all fits together, and therefore I'm able to discern in a very different way to maybe other people could what is really going to be a very good impacting project.
Lovely, thank you. So that brings us on. So 15 is life on land, which I guess a bit like the ocean. You know, there's a very obvious link to tourism, isn't there? Supporting life on land. Yes. I'm assuming you do one of the African sea elephants, giraffe type.
I actually work with a Maasai owned lodge. So created in conjunction, in partnership with the Maasai community. And it was literally handed over in ownership to the Maasai community. They make the decisions. They're supported by the people that help set them up. But the money supports the community of 16,000 Maasai. It's huge. So they support them with education, with health, as well as conservation. And we get issues in conservation, life on land conservation, around things like wildlife-human conflict. So, for example, Maasai historically were, you know, they're pastoralists. So they have their cattle, and they look after their cattle. And historically, they would have killed predator species such as lions because they would have threatened the cattle. So what tourism can do is create a fund that says, Maasai, please don't kill the lions, because actually it's the lions that tourists want to come and see. So if we don't have the lions, we don't have the tourism. But if we have the tourism and they can actually contribute a conservation fee daily, that money then compensates the Maasai if they lose any cattle due to lions. And that keeps the Maasai happy, basically. So it's about finding the balance, working between people and land, and keeping that sort of harmonious balance at the same time as enabling us to conserve the species that are important to the world. I mean, this actually comes in this. Another issue comes from the, if we were to stop flying, well, we might as well then say, well, forget elephants, forget rhino, forget giraffe, forget, all the iconic species, because so much of their conservation and preservation is actually supported by tourism. And so, yeah, life on land, very important. Humanity comes along and wrecks it, basically. There's a blog on my site, which might be interesting to people, which is how can we balance tourism in the age of both climate and nature breakdown, which is what we're facing at the moment. All very serious, but it's all about having that holistic balance. And that's why I wanted to talk about all the SDGs today, because it's so important for us to find the positive impacts, work on those, not be on those negative impacts, move the way we live away from those negative impacts.
It is very powerful though, because it is about all of our choices, isn't it?
It's all, absolutely, yeah.
I felt a little bit too small for all of this, and everything's going on over here and up there and out there, and actually it's not. It's all of us can, and I wrote a really, really offensive letter with lots of rude words in. I did amend it before I sent it, but I feel now like I can demand, and I can ask, and I can question, and I think I feel quite empowered by these, actually, to say this is the world we want, and if we all work together, this can happen. And
in travel, that hasn't really happened historically, consumers demanding that. It's happened more quickly in fashion, I think, because fashion's tangible. Tourism is intangible. It's services. It's too complex for people. It's energy, it's waste, it's water, it's staff, it's all these things that people don't really want to think about that when they go on holiday. They want it all to be looked after. But unless consumers ask about it and demand it, too many companies won't change because they don't have to. And so what we need is government changing policy, but also consumers demanding that change. And the companies that are in the middle that aren't doing it until now have to make those changes as well. Yeah. So it's about everyone. It's all the stakeholders getting involved and making those changes. And, I felt like you, when I wanted to start my business, I'm like, how on earth can I, as one little person in the world, and I deal with a very global world, how the hell can I have an impact when, I haven't got the money behind me of a massive tourism company and I thought, well, you know what, I've got knowledge, I've got experience, and I've got a computer. So I can do my bit and let's see where it gets me. So I'm trying. we can all do our little bit, right? And focus on what we're good at.
Absolutely. So 16 is one of the ones I sort of struggled with, if I'm honest, because again, it feels very grand, doesn't it? It's peace, justice, and strong institutions. Yeah. And I have to say, I do sometimes look at some of the international institutions, and justice in particular is a big one for me at the moment, and I just think it's gone to the dogs, really. How do I work within a system that I find fundamentally flawed, and being led by people I find fundamentally flawed? So I've been trying to link it to number 17, which is partnerships, because I think some of these are too big to manage on our own, and that's okay. That means that we find a person with different skills to us, or with a different way to manage, and we can get together and make change by doing things together.
Yes, but interestingly, you did talk about peace earlier without even possibly realizing it. When we talked about when you go on holiday and you're connecting with local people, it's about connecting with the culture, and that's those peaceful societies. Without that peaceful environment, we wouldn't be able to do that. So we don't have tourism into war zones, generally. We have post-war zones occasionally. People get quite extreme on that. But so much of tourism is about cultural interaction and about understanding and tolerance of each other. And so we were talking about that basically, because tourism, one of its currencies really is multicultural exchange and understanding and taking a proactive interest in other people's lives. And that's partly what we've lost through mass tourism. because we've lost an interest in culture. It's become about sun, eat as much as you can, drink as much as you can, play. It's kind of lost the cultural side of things, and actually I think a lot of sustainable tourism is about getting back the cultural side of things, and it's about that working with communities, which is the partnerships.
It's interesting, isn't it? We have lost that connection with travel being the exciting bit. It's been very sort of
functional.
Yeah, it has. It's fascinating, isn't it? That we think we're spending all this money on this wonderful experience, but actually, have we had this wonderful experience, or have we just done something that we've been sort of primed to tell us is the wonderful bit? Are we just feeding into this?
We've fed into a very what is a very huge capitalist industry, and it's one of the things, I would love to see the whole industry change. Obviously, I want to help create that change. And what the core thing to remember about sustainable tourism is it puts host communities first. And therefore, for the money, for the skills, for the purchasing, for the needs, nothing happens without those host communities choosing it, deciding it, allowing it. And therefore it becomes much more cultural in approach. And if we have that partnership with them, where we're not dictating the terms from outside, they are determining the terms from bottom up, it completely changes how we value those experiences. And at the root of all this is justice, because it's about human rights and respect. And it's about having transparency over that. It's about their personal freedoms, their freedoms to choose, not us determining their futures. And so, so much of that is missing in mass tourism, where we've become exploitative. It's mass tourism is largely really a sort of continuation of colonization. It's become exploitative and inconsiderate. And it's about saying, no, that's not the way. And something I suppose, with me being an ambassador for DEFRA, if we look at that as an institution, it's a government department. What's amazing is they are saying, we have this year a year of green action, and here's how we're going to support people, and we're going to create various events, and we get involved in various things. And they have a year of green action website, which gives people daily or easy to do actions that consumers can do themselves to think, I can make a change. I can be empowered to make changes, and I can, it shouldn't all be on the consumer to change. It has to be the government too, but it has to be everybody, because it's not going to change without everybody, like you say. So coming on to the partnerships, no man is an island. Tourism works globally because it has policy, finance, law, systems, processes, data, tech stuff, trade. We can't do that alone. It all happens in conjunction with each other. What we have to do is say it's equal partnerships, and not I'm more important than you, in a outsider to an insider sort of perspective.
Yeah. It has been a roller coaster. Thank you so much, Vicky, for your time today.
That's not bad. Look, all the SDGs in just over an hour. That was pretty good.
It's just amazing, and I think that's what I've really enjoyed this month. Is I've taken something I found overwhelming, and actually I do feel quite connected to them now. Not all of them equally at the moment, but I do feel like there's things that I can do at home that have an impact, and I think that's a really great message, and about making choices.
And when the UN created these SDGs, some people were fairly critical. I think they're brilliant to come up with 17 things which you can structure that works at a global UN policy level, but actually does filter down to the common person on the street and how you can start to change. It's like you say, it's just about learning about it a little bit and understanding, and the more you talk about it and the more you read about it, the more you can think how it applies. And you don't have to do everything. Not everyone has to do everything, there's no pressure, but it's we can all do our little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely have cherry picked a couple that I that feel, I could do something about that quickly, or I could do something. I mean, it's a stupid thing really, but we were thinking about sustainable communities, and for ages, probably over well, years actually, I've loved these little libraries you get in America where people at the end of their front garden, have a little place, you know, you can borrow books. Well, and I made it happen. It happened. We have one in our front garden. It happened over the weekend.
Well done.
It wasn't difficult. It didn't cost any money. And it's just a little something. But it felt good. And I was like, that's number 11 on the SDGs.
That's awesome. How do you do it? Is it a swap?
Yeah. So it's an old fridge. It's an old fridge freezer.
Excellent.
That would have gone to the tip. And it now has books in. It has books, adults in the top and children's in the bottom, in the freezer bit. And help yourself. Bring one, borrow one, whatever. And it's also number 4, I think. I'm going to throw education in there. There's some non-fiction in there. And it's about, I think it's about taking something that feels very large and making it fit you, if you know what I mean, and what you could do around them. But I found it really interesting to have them as a focus, to have them on the fridge, and just to sort of, they're filtering into how I think about things, and that's been really fascinating.
I mean, and for me as a business, you know, it helps structure. Because otherwise we could all go off a bit of tangents, to be honest. I mean, I'll go above and beyond the SDGs, but because tourism does get into so many cultural things, and they're not, I don't feel they're fully represented through it, but that's because the SDGs have to be measurable and monitorable, and culture isn't. So culture is very intangible. So that's an interesting area for me. Well, as I say, I'm sure we'll come back to this perhaps another time, because I think there's loads more there that we could talk about. But thank you so much, Vicky. It's been an absolute education. I feel that we have covered quite a few of these. We've done well
in our conversation today. So thank you, and I wish you every success.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear
with EarthChangers.
Anyone watching, you know, what they find interesting, what they pick up on most, because it's always good to hear those external perspectives and what they learnt maybe from listening.
Lovely. And I'll put in a couple of those links in the comments as well. And if I miss any, feel free to add them.
I'll send you a bunch now.
Yeah, lovely. I think it's nice to have that. It's nice to have a jumping off point, isn't it? And then to discover more about the bits that really interest you. Fab stuff.
Okay.
Okay, then. I'm going to wish you well and say goodbye.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lat.